B. Collins.
Peter B. Collins, news and comments. It's Wednesday, July 22nd, 2020. Maybe you've noticed it too. But Americans are numbed to the casual corruption of Donald Trump and his Republican entourage. And as I report some new corruption to you today, I predict that you will not be shocked, just offended. So the latest comes from the New York Times, breaking a story from Great Britain. And every ambassador under every administration who gets to serve as the U.S. envoy to Britain has made a huge cash contribution to his patron, the President of the United States. And Woody, who is our ambassador there today, Robert Wood Johnson IV, heir to the Johnson & Johnson fortune, owner of the New York Jets, the operator of the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation, which actually does a lot of good. Well, he was pressured by his patron, by the man who gave him the gig, Donald Trump, back in 2018, saying, hey, get me the British Open. And by that he meant he wanted Robert Wood Johnson to trade influence with his British counterparts and get them to steer the British Open golf tournament to the Trump resort in Scotland called Turnberry, which reportedly loses about $1 million a year. And one of the marketing goals of the Trump organization, including the idiot sons of the president, has been to attract golf tournaments to their properties because they get free television exposure, and that's good for business. Not to mention the patronage that comes from bringing the golfers and their entourages to these courses. And what's really offensive about this is that it violates the Constitution, the Emoluments Clause, but it's not explicitly illegal for the president to try to profit from being president. We've never written laws like that because no one ever expected that a grifter and con man like Trump would occupy our top office. So Trump leaned on Woody, and Woody was told by his number two, a guy named Louis Lukens, who's a career diplomat, bad idea, Woody. Unethical. Don't do it. But Johnson listened to Trump. He squeezed Lukens out. And now we have the latest scandal on our hands, which shows the sordid and, as I say, casual corruption of Trump. And it's become just background noise. This is how we live today in a banana republic that we used to have some regard for. And I want to credit David Sirota. I've linked to his newsletter so you can read the blockbuster that he issued today. Steve Schwartzman is a billionaire based in New York. He is a friend of Trump and a major donor to Trump's political machine. He runs the group called Blackstone. He's also a major benefactor of one Mitch McConnell. Schwartzman has donated $10 million to the Senate Leadership Fund, the super PAC, affiliated with McConnell. And the scene of the crime here is the Commonwealth of Kentucky, which is where McConnell hails from. And just as a little background, earlier this year, when states were begging for bailouts from Washington, Mitch McConnell said, well, I don't want to send our money to bail out bad governments. And he has long been trying to kill the pension fund for teachers and other state employees in Kentucky. But it's also been fleeced by Blackstone and by other advisors. And so the U.S. Supreme Court recently declared that workers and retirees can't sue a company like Blackstone or Goldman Sachs because they say that the workers and retirees whose benefits have been squandered don't have legal standing. And a Kentucky court then quickly cited that ruling to short-circuit retirees' case against Wall Street giants Blackstone and KKR. That's the hedge fund Kohlberg, Kravis, and Roberts. But the Republican Attorney General of Kentucky on Monday, his name is Daniel Cameron, intervened to sue on behalf of the state government, a maneuver that likely renders that standing issue of the actual pensioners moot. The suit alleges that the firms misled the state into funneling retirees' money into investments that were secretive, opaque, illiquid, impossible to properly monitor or accurately value, high-fee, high-risk gambles with no historical record of performance. That is quite a mouthful. The suit goes on to assert that these were absolutely unsuitable investments for a pension fund in the particular situation that Kentucky was in. And it reminds me of the way Goldman Sachs set up the nation of Greece. He said, don't worry, we'll take those onerous pension funds that you can't really afford to pay for anymore, and we'll hide them offshore for you. It's a really neat, sneaky move. Look what it did for Enron. So one of the other issues is that Blackstone is being accused of getting the taxpayers of Kentucky, or at least the pension fund, to reimburse it for the cost of private jets for Blackstone officials to fly to Kentucky on to conduct their fraud. This is quite astounding. Read all about it in David Sirota's newsletter, and if you're so inclined, feel free to support him. I think he's doing a lot of good work and great muckraking investigative reporting like this. Now, the other sordid deed just in the past 24 hours is that Trump is doing something that he knows is unconstitutional and impossible to achieve, even if people went along with it. And that is that the census, which is currently being conducted in this country, and it's been hampered by the COVID pandemic, is supposed to be completed by the end of this year so that they can count all the people, and then those data collections become the basis for redistricting. Each state looks at the population according to the census and then divvies up congressional and state legislative districts. So Trump issued a statement that is purely political. It will be shot down in the courts if it ever gets there. And, of course, he plays to patriotism and brags about his own. There used to be a time, he wrote, when you could proudly declare, I'm a citizen of the United States. But now the radical left is trying to erase the existence of this concept and conceal the number of illegal aliens in our country. This is all part of a broader left-wing effort to erode the rights of American citizens, and I will not stand for it. So what he wants to do is order the Bureau of Census, which is part of the Commerce Department, to subtract out non-citizens, what he calls illegal aliens. Only the Constitution requires the census to count everybody who is living in the United States. It does not make a distinction based on citizenship. And the Supreme Court, in what was a technical punt, rejected the attempt by the Trump administration to insert a question about citizenship in the 2020 census. When I say it was a technical punt, they said that the reasoning that they were offered for this plan seems to have been contrived, which was a really polite way of saying it was bullshit. And this is part of the same schemes for the Republican minority to maintain majority rule. And one analysis is that it would cost California, New York, and Texas each a single congressional seat. But Trump is pandering to his nativist, America first, make America great people. I'll just leave it at that. Then, of course, there is the power grab, deploying these armed militias currently in Portland. Chicago is threatened as the next stop. There appears to be a scheme to send some of these armed goons to Kansas City. And 15 mayors of major U.S. cities sent a letter to U.S. federal law enforcement officials demanding a stop to the sending of federal forces to cities and the removal of the officers from Portland, Oregon. The mayors of Seattle, L.A., Atlanta, Washington, and a handful of other cities signed the letter addressed to the Attorney General and the Acting Secretary of Homeland Security, Chad Wolf. Quote, federal officers have not been trained for urban community policing, including critical crowd management and de-escalation techniques. There is no oversight of the actions of federal forces. And later in the letter, they write, the president and his administration continually attack local leadership, amplifying false and divisive rhetoric purely for campaign fodder. Now get this, Adam Schiff. You know him. He chairs the House Intelligence Committee. He ran the Russiagate stuff, and then he ran the Ukraine investigation and the impeachment. And he's now standing up against domestic surveillance by the Department of Homeland Security. He is shocked at what he calls unprecedented, expanded intelligence and related activities in support of a policy that exceeds the department's historical mission and contrary to constitutionally protected rights of speech, assembly, and protest. So Schiff is decrying what is reported as surveillance on First Amendment protesters by the Department of Homeland Security. He also is opposed to the deployment of these unmarked federal officers who are heavily armed to places like Portland. He wrote, so far as this committee is aware, never before has the department sought to aggressively counter potential threats of graffiti, vandalism, or other minor damage to monuments and federal buildings by deploying its officers in this manner. But this is the same Adam Schiff who is working so hard to renew the expired surveillance authorities that were sunsetted earlier this year. And I want to credit Ryan Grimm at The Intercept for noting this hypocrisy, because the House has really two issues before it. One is the funding for the Department of Homeland Security, and they could easily set that aside to put pressure on Acting Director Chad Wolf and the Trump administration about these deployments in American cities. But it appears that the House leadership, and Adam Schiff is a major player, they want to lump the DHS budget in with labor and health and human services and just pass it. And this is an opportunity. And Pramila Jayapal, the Democrat from near Seattle, Washington State, she is fighting. The Congressional Progressive Caucus is urging leadership either not to bring up the bill at all or to break it off from labor-HHS and allow for a separate vote. But then we get to these surveillance authorities. And over on the Senate side, Pat Leahy of Vermont, a Democrat, Mike Lee of Utah, a Republican. They sent a letter to the Attorney General, Bill Barr, and the latest Director of National Intelligence, John Ratcliffe, demanding assurance that the government is no longer conducting surveillance under the expired law, and asking whether the government believes it has the authority to conduct such surveillance absent the legislation. And guess who is working so hard to renew that legislation unamended? That would be one Adam Schiff. And he's tangling with Silicon Valley Congresswoman Zoe Lofgren, who does care about our Fourth Amendment rights, who has pushed to limit these surveillance authorities that have been granted to the government serially and that were sealed in place by Obama. And Grimm writes that intelligence agencies under Adam Schiff's interpretation of the language could legally target DACA recipients for warrantless dragnet surveillance because they're not citizens, which would then make whatever data they also collected on American citizens the legal result of incidental collection. That secret data could be turned over to secret federal police, who could make arrests from their unmarked minivans. And these are not far-fetched scenarios. And it shows that despite their rhetoric and their posture, the Democrats, and especially Adam Schiff, cannot be trusted to protect our constitutional rights. Interesting article, today's Washington Post. It examines the role of Homeland Security, an agency formed to prevent another September 11th-like attack. Legal analysts, they say that while the department has broad authority to enforce federal laws, officers' actions, especially in Portland, seem to be pushing the boundaries and pulling Homeland Security into a domestic policing role. Do you think? And they quote Stephen Vladeck, a law professor at UT Austin. There's a line that it certainly looks like they've crossed, and if I may, it's an important line because it's the difference between federal law enforcement and a roving commission where you're using these law enforcement officers to go out and restore what they deem to be order. And this is where Congress has the power of the purse. They should be holding up the funding for the Department of Homeland Security. They should be clarifying its role, which is not to Bigfoot local police on protesters or even street violence in Chicago. And when you see the gross exaggerations that are used by Trump and Chad Wolf to claim that, Portland is a city that's ablaze and out of control, it's a 4-block area. The rest of Portland is unaffected. Life goes on. And I want to take a moment to praise our listener and subscriber, John Zwiebel in Hawaii. Because out of the blue, about a week ago, he just sent me a brief email. And he said, I bet that Blackwater or similar hired guns are part of that contingent in Portland. And last night, in a Rachel Maddow interview, Jay Johnson, who was Obama's Homeland Security Secretary, he said, the Federal Protection Service, the FPS, they're one of the units deployed in Portland. And their mission is to defend federal property, federal buildings. And what he disclosed is telling. He said most of those people are private security contractors. They are not government employees. And while Blackwater is no longer a thing, he changed its name, and I can't remember what it's called now. Zyron, or I don't know. John Zwiebel had a good hunch, and it appears to be quite accurate. So this is the moment when the Democrats in the House should be debating the function of Homeland Security and pointing out that Portland is not that function, and making efforts to block future abuses of power by deploying these kinds of stormtroopers. I don't think Gestapo is too strong a word, that have no place in our nation under our system or what's left of it. So in New York City today, the dwindling group of protesters and homeless people of Occupy City Hall were rousted a little before 4 o'clock in the morning by a group of heavily armed officers. They were moved off the public property. Officers took down a series of tarps and tents. They told the occupants that they had to leave, but they could come back and pick up their shit. But when they did, all their shit had been deposited in garbage trucks and taken away. And let's see who's quoted here. Raymond Spinella, Police Department Chief of Support Services, said several hundred officers moved into the park at 3:40 a.m. They gave the residents a 10-minute warning. The decision had been reached with City Hall. You can read that, meaning Mayor Bill de Blasio, and based on the relatively few number of people remaining in the park. Meanwhile, in Philadelphia, we get this report from Shadowproof and reporter Maddie Rose. An encampment of homeless people who created a massive tent city are being threatened with having their encampment forcibly dismantled. And this is an effort to draw attention to the plight of homeless people in the city of brotherly love. There are over 150 of these tents or lean-tos in a sprawling tent city on a grassy field along the Benjamin Franklin Parkway. They want them out of there because they're occupying a baseball field. And I know baseball is coming back without crowds and with fake crowd noise in the TV broadcasts. And there's some people who consider that to be a wonderful development, and gosh, I'm happy for you. But I don't think this has anything to do with the Phillies. And so that is the scene in Philadelphia. And back to New York for a moment, because there is wrangling in Albany in the state legislature to rewrite laws to prevent New York police and prosecutors from giving unlimited detention to people who were picked up for First Amendment offenses. We know that in early June, many of the protesters who were arrested, either for doing nothing or for violating curfew, were held for several days, even though the clear policy is that they couldn't be held for more than 24 hours without seeing a judge. That's state law. And in a legal decision brought by, in a case brought by advocates for the jailed protesters, Judge James M. Burke of the State Supreme Court in Manhattan sided with the police and wrote a one-line decision: all writs are denied. Lawyers for the police had asserted that the NYPD faced unprecedented challenges with both a pandemic and widespread protests raging. And so now there is an effort to refine that law by a Democratic lawmaker in Albany. Back to Portland now. There were more protests overnight. Protesters brought pool noodles. You know what that is. They're little things you float on. Umbrellas, sleds, body armor pieced together with bicycle helmets and football pads. And once again, they confronted these federal goons. One of the protesters said, well, it's really organic and non-centralized. They don't have a leader who can negotiate either with the feds or with the local politicals and cops. In the early morning hours today, protesters used a range of tactics. Some of them spent their time chanting, dancing, or locking arms. Others slowly chipped away at a temporary wooden facade of the courthouse building, pulling away a whole panel to expose an entryway. Others dragged in barricades to cover the building's entrances. And at one point, late Tuesday, federal agents rushed out of the courthouse and shoved a group of mothers, that's the wall of moms, wearing their matching yellow shirts as tear gas billowed around them. In another moment, the agents knocked down one protester onto a pole. After clearing a park, they rummaged through a makeshift kitchen that's been used to feed the protesters, knocking food and supplies to the ground. That describes a police riot. I mean, really, is the wall of moms a threat to them? And despite a court order not to use tear gas in Portland, do these arrogant bastards have to show that they're not going to let some lousy local regulation limit their brutal tactics? And BuzzFeed features a report today from a photographer who's been covering the protests since they began some 55 nights ago. His name is Matthew Lewis Rolland. And he said that Monday night, the evening of violence, left him extremely shaken. I hadn't seen the feds raise their guns like they did tonight. I saw them pointing them at everybody and anyone, including me. BuzzFeed publishes a picture of Matthew Lewis Rolland being confronted at point-blank range by a federal agent in camo with a helmet, gas mask, and brandishing a weapon. And he said, "Last night was the most horrifying thing I've ever experienced in my life. I got shot at, gassed, more times than I can imagine." And he is a wedding photographer who also likes to take pictures of rock concerts. But that business has gone away, so he's decided to use his skills to cover protests. He also live streams on Facebook. He said to produce evidence, not as a public service or part of his photography. And referring to the events on the street last night, he said it was the cleanest, most wholesome I've ever seen of the protest I've been covering. And he referred to the wall of moms. He said, "The last picture I take before they storm out of the federal building is a picture of one of the wall of moms with her helmet. She's probably in her 50s. The next picture is guns pointed and people getting beaten." So this is way out of control. It is a police riot. I want to underscore that language. It is unprovoked. And this is America under Trump in the summer of 2020. So a member of Congress is calling for officers to get rid of the camo, get back in the uniforms that they wear, whether they work for ICE or the prison guards contingent or Federal Protective Services. Ruben Gallego, Democrat of Arizona, a Marine Corps veteran, member of the House Armed Services Committee, said Department of Homeland Security and other federal agencies should not allow their officers to wear camouflage and to be unmarked. Now, I consider this to be a local issue, but because Trump and, Josh Hawley, the senator from Missouri, have tried to make this a national issue. You know how on June 28th, this couple, Mark and Patricia McCloskey, who own a mega mansion in St. Louis, marchers came by their home as they were headed for the mayor's home. And Mark and Patricia McCloskey did apparently feel pretty scared. So Mark was brandishing an AR-15 or some other semi-automatic rifle, and Patricia had a handgun that she was pointing at protesters. And it appears they did conduct minor trespass on the property of the McCloskeys. But I can't really judge whether this was a justified display of weapons or not. And I support the local prosecutor, Kim Gardner, who has filed felony weapons charges against the couple. But pandering to the NRA and the Second Amendment extremists, you got Trump, Missouri State Attorney General Eric Schmidt, the governor, the senator. They're all saying that this is overreach. This is an abuse of power. Now, come on. All she did was file charges. There'll be a case. They can defend themselves, and we may find out the true nature of this event and whether their brandishing of the weapons was reasonable. But instead, we have these people who are intervening and trying to abort the legal process and impose their own view, in most cases remotely, on this particular situation. Every day I pause for a minute to thank the people who support my work here at the Peter B. Collins Podcast. And as you know, your subscription contributions have been going into the community fund. People like Clifford Johnson, who's been a very generous supporter for many years, Jim Garrison, Ted Kelly, Teresa Paris. And there's Terry Paris again. These are the generous people who validate what I do and help pay for my internet service and all the other costs of doing this podcast. And I'm very grateful to you. I do not have a request for a grant from the community fund today, and it's not too late to make one. So if you could use $100 to cover your lack of an income, the threatened cutoff of your unemployment money that could happen at the end of this week, just send an email to peter@peterbcollins.com. I mentioned John Zwiebel. He's a big supporter of Shahid Buttar, who is challenging Nancy Pelosi for the second election cycle in a row for her seat in Congress from San Francisco. I've known Shahid for, at least 15 years. I met him when he was the executive director of the Bill of Rights Defense Committee. And he's a man I know and like. During the Occupy years, I took a day and we went to Oakland and Berkeley and visited the Occupy scenes. So I don't know him personally well enough to evaluate what I'm about to tell you. But John Zwiebel emailed this to me last night. It didn't make it into the Chronicle print edition today, probably because it was posted too late. But the Chronicle reports that Elizabeth Croydon, a comedian, artist, and filmmaker, wrote a post on Medium Tuesday that Shahid Buttar harassed her starting when they both lived in Washington, D.C. in 2003 and continued to do so for many years. And what she is saying is that he made a number of unwanted approaches to her, that she tried to distance. She writes, I physically distanced myself from him at parties, turned down invitations, informed a friend I felt uncomfortable, avoided being alone with him, and eventually stopped going to the communal home where he lived until he moved out. Shahid let me know he was sexually available to me for years. Croydon reported one incident that happened 10 years later. It was intimately embarrassing and traumatic for her to talk about. After a poetry performance, and Buttar is quite a talented rapper. You give him a beat and he can lay out some incredible stuff. Well, after a performance, she wrote, she and Buttar gathered with a group of people to catch up. One friend asked everyone, when was the last time they had sex? And Croydon said she had been celibate for years. Shahid's response shocked and embarrassed me, she wrote. Oh, my God, that is way too long. How can you go without sex that long? That's insane. I couldn't do it, you poor thing. It must be so hard. Croydon wrote that she had replied that her celibacy was a voluntary decision because it helped me cope with surviving sexual assaults, batteries, and other misconduct. I felt degraded, nauseated, and revolted that he would mock me in front of friends who looked to me as an outspoken voice for women. So Buttar responded to this. Every survivor must be heard. I hope to be allowed the same opportunity to be heard as well. Sexual harassment is despicable. Those who exploit structural sexism and power imbalances must be exposed. I am committed to putting survivors' interests before my own. And he said that Croydon's accusations are false. Now, based on this account, and it's limited, I have to say that Croydon could be projecting her own issues here, where she described herself as a survivor of sexual assault. Did Shahid Buttar know that? And for him to say that, wow, being celibate for years, how can you go without sex for that long? That is not necessarily an invitation for him to solve that problem for her. And so at this point, I have to say this appears to be misplaced exchanges where Buttar may have found Ms. Croydon to be attractive and desirable. He sent mating signals, dating signals, and she did not pick up on them. Did he do anything more? Did he force himself on her? So far, that is not alleged. And so I have very mixed feelings. I report to this to you with what I know, without judgment of either Croydon or Buttar. And we will have to see how it plays out. But it does bring to mind the question of whatever happened to Tara Reade. Joe Biden managed to just squelch her very serious allegations, not of sexual harassment, not of unwanted expression, verbal. But her accusation was of digital rape. And the media has just moved on. The Democrats consider it an issue that's been resolved. Tara Reade has disappeared. And I consider it to be an open question. Meanwhile, in the House, led by Pelosi, a bill introduced by her number 2, Steny Hoyer, would replace 3 statues of Confederates that currently are displayed in the Capitol building of the United States. Charles Aycock, John C. Calhoun, and James P. Clark would be removed, and at least one would be replaced by a bust of Thurgood Marshall, the first black member of the U.S. Supreme Court. And in another purge of a major historical figure, the Sierra Club has announced that it is telling the truth now about its founder, the father of the national parks, the wilderness prophet, the patron saint of American wilderness, John Muir. And I have to say, I don't know that much about his history. But the executive director, Michael Brune, said it's time to take down some of our own monuments, starting with some truth-telling about the Sierra Club's early history. Muir, who fought to preserve Yosemite Valley and Sequoia National Forest, real gems here in California, once referred to African Americans as lazy Sambos, a racist pejorative that many black people consider to be even more offensive than the N-word. And he is accused of being very, what's the right word? Expressing hate for Native Americans. Now, again, I don't know the dimensions of this. Until about 10 or 15 years ago, we had a breakfast chain of restaurants in California called Sambo's. And I don't know that at the time that John Muir walked the earth and admired Yosemite Valley, just how offensive Sambo's was as a term. But I'll take the Sierra Club's word for it. Donald Trump is championing the environment. I just got one of those uninvited tweets from him. The Twitter jammed on me, saying that he's excited about the opportunity to sign the Great American Outdoors Act. This is one of the few bipartisan bits of legislation to survive both houses this year. It allocates $9.5 billion for deferred maintenance of national parks and sets up almost $1 trillion, $900 million a year to acquire land for conservation and to continue maintenance. I support that because as a senior, I bought one of those lifetime passes to the national parks. I've got plans to visit some, and I'd like them to be properly maintained. Meanwhile, the conflict is surfacing, both internally with Republicans and between Republicans and Democrats over the next bailout package. And as I mentioned, the unemployment benefits run out for many states this Saturday night. Others end with the end of the calendar month. And so we're told that the real conflicts are over that $600 bonus from the feds. It's pretty clear the Republicans want to roll that back. The payroll tax does appear to be dead, and that's good news. The idea of more stimulus checks, probably tailored for lower-income families, doesn't offend me, but $1,200 is meaningless. It's not going to help avoid an eviction or a foreclosure or the repossession of an automobile by somebody who's out of work. For somebody who's out of work. Then they're battling over testing. Trump and his cronies say, there's $10 billion they haven't even spent yet. But why hasn't that money been spent? I think it's because of Republicans. And then there's the battle over bailouts for state and local government. There should be at least $1 trillion for that alone. The issue of tying school reopenings to funding for schools. And the demand by Mitch McConnell for liability protection. Here's today's COVID-19 update. Linda Lewis is back on the case. Our top-line numbers, worldwide, 15 million cases confirmed with 618,000 deaths. In the United States, almost 4 million cases with 142,000 deaths. New data from the City Health Dashboard at New York University shows how drastically the risk of COVID-19 infection can vary from neighborhood to neighborhood within the same city. The City Health Dashboard calculates that neighborhood-level COVID-19 infection risk for the nation's 500 largest urban areas based on 23 metrics, including race, poverty, overcrowded housing, and more. And Time magazine used the dashboard to map Los Angeles, revealing a huge variation in neighborhood-level COVID-19 risk. It's negligible in heavily white, wealthy areas like Brentwood and Bel Air, where the risk is much higher in Boyle Heights, a heavily Hispanic area, where many residents live below the poverty line. And I want to mention my friend Suzanne Bowen. She's a journalist and a science writer, author of several books. And she was one of the first to tease out the connection between bad health outcomes and zip codes that identified poverty-stricken neighborhoods. So this is consistent with that model. Linda updates us on Donald Trump in that interview with Chris Wallace on Sunday, where Wallace presented him less than 2 minutes into the interview a troubling statistic. We have the 7th highest mortality rate in the world, he said. And Trump said, well, when you talk about mortality rates, I think it's the opposite. Wallace insisted that's not true, sir. So then he trotted out, Trump did, Kayleigh McEnany, with a document. And he tried to use that to claim that his claim is accurate. And Linda says, as I explained last week, Trump has spent the past 3 months trying to disguise his failure to keep Americans from dying of COVID-19 by telling the same lie, that the per capita death toll in the U.S., known as the mortality rate, is among the lowest in the world. And as of last Friday, the day that Wallace interviewed Trump, there were indeed just 6 countries in the world with more than 100,000 citizens that had more per capita deaths than the United States, according to Johns Hopkins. The Intercept looked at a freeze frame of the chart produced by Trump in his Sunday interview and noticed something that neither Trump nor Wallace and his producers apparently did. The chart was based on case fatality rates, not mortality rates. Well, the mortality rate measures how many citizens per capita have died from a disease. The case fatality rate is the ratio between deaths from a disease and the total number of confirmed cases. It's misleading to measure when countries are testing at different rates and the entire populations of those countries have not been tested. On both measures, however, the U.S. ranks lower than several other countries. So Trump returned to the podium in the press room at the White House yesterday, and it was a bit surprising. He only spoke for, 25, maybe 35 minutes? He did not trot out any of his medical advisors. Fauci said he was not invited, and Trump responded to a reporter that Dr. Birx was right outside. But he pretty much stayed to script, and they wrote this for him. They wrote in some compassion because he doesn't have any. As one family, we mourn every precious life that's been lost. I pledge in their honor that we will develop a vaccine and defeat the virus. We're doing very well with vaccine development, therapeutic development, but I want to thank our brave doctors and nurses and frontline responders. The job they do is incredible. They're truly brave. My administration will stop at nothing to save lives and shield the vulnerable. And then he did a 180 about masks. And I saw some video clips last night. I declined to watch the briefing itself. And now he is lecturing young people. America's youth will act responsibly. We're asking everybody, when you're not able to socially distance, wear a mask, get a mask. Whether you like the mask or not, they have an impact. They'll have an effect. And we need everything we can get. And then they fed him a line that he read with some obvious discomfort. He said things will probably, unfortunately, get worse before they get better. Then he went on to say, we have tremendous supplies, a great supply chain, whether it's ventilators or gowns or just about anything they need. So that's a big difference from inheriting very, very empty cupboards. Well, number one, there are PPE shortages remaining. And as hospitals get pretty well filled up, ICUs are overflowing in some states. That demand continues, and there is still no coordinated effort to get those supplies to the places where they are badly needed. So Linda quotes a comment from NBC News. Trump is trying to make the U.S. look better by emphasizing the ratio between confirmed deaths and confirmed cases over the more telling mortality rate. The former lowers as testing expands and detects more mild cases, while the latter reveals how many deaths a country has had relative to its population. And there was that odd moment when a reporter changed the subject and asked about Ghislaine Maxwell. A lot of people want to know if she's going to turn in powerful people. And you've talked in the past about Prince Andrew. You've criticized Bill Clinton's behavior. I'm wondering, do you feel she's going to turn in powerful men? How do you see that working out? Well, Trump said, I don't know. I haven't really been following it too much. I just wish her well, frankly. Now, how many criminal suspects accused of recruiting young girls for a predatory partner should be wished well by the President of the United States? That's just part of that numbness that we referred to at the beginning of the podcast today. Trump and others around him say that he is being tested for the COVID virus at least once a day, sometimes multiple times, although Trump has said he's never had more than one test a day. Denmark is being used as a model for school reopenings. The way they did it, when children under 12 returned to school, they were sectioned off into microgroups of 12 students. They called them protective bubbles. They arrive to school at staggered times. They eat lunch separately. They have their own zones in the playground. All students are required to wash their hands every 2 hours. They don't have to wear face masks. Desks are divided 2 meters apart. All education material must be cleaned twice a day, and classes are held outside whenever possible. Parents are not allowed on school property. And they're saying that these measures appear to have been successful since the schools reopened. There have been no increased cases. But in Israel, as we have reported before, and I see very little comment on this in the mainstream media here in the United States. Israeli children initially followed a bubble model when they returned to school on May 3rd. During a heat wave, children were permitted to leave masks at home. But by June 3rd, the Israeli government was forced to close down the schools after 2,000 students, teachers, and staff tested positive for COVID-19. 28,000 students were placed under quarantine due to possible exposure to the virus. And at one single school, there was over 130 cases. Nationwide, the numbers went up from 50 new cases a day to 1,500 a day within a month of schools reopening. I think this is the cautionary tale. And it is just not mentioned in American media. And Linda's final item today, as manufacturers around the world race to develop vaccines, a parallel effort has begun to figure out who in the U.S. should get them first and how those doses should be distributed. But it appears that there are 4 different groups trying to evaluate this question. And we have a quote from Michael Osterholm, University of Minnesota Center for Infectious Diseases Research. He said, "It seems like we've just assigned 4 different air traffic control towers to land the same plane." Oh, that's going to work out great. The U.S. has signed a deal with the Pfizer pharmaceutical giant, $2 billion almost, to deliver 100 million doses of a vaccine that doesn't exist. The timeline is set for December delivery. They're saying that with these payments, the American individuals who take the vaccine would get it at no charge. But the problem we have, and it's aired out in a kind of weak article in the Washington Post today, is that we don't know if the antibodies that are produced when people have a live case of COVID-19 or produced by a vaccine, we don't know how long those antibodies survive. And some of the reports show a very short lifespan for it. And this WashPost article opens with the description of a woman who's a guard for the women's NBA team in Phoenix, the Mercury. Her name is Sophie Cunningham. And she returned to training last week after a bout with COVID-19 and said, "Well, this is my second time." And I've told you about some isolated anecdotal cases of people who have had it twice. A 60-some-year-old woman in Southern California was hospitalized 2 separate times with what were described as 2 separate cases of coronavirus. Now, the Post says, without detailing who these doctors are, quote, "Doctors emphasize there is no evidence of widespread vulnerability to reinfection, and it's difficult to know what to make of these cases in the absence of detailed lab work." But based on the British studies about antibodies, at this point, I'm quite dubious that there is any vaccine that could be developed, properly tested, with assurance that it is safe for massive distribution at any time in the foreseeable future, much less December. Well, we continue to follow the story of this suspect who is accused of the gunfire that killed the son of a federal judge in New Jersey, and that would be Esther Salas. The alleged suspect is attorney Roy Den Hollander, and yesterday we shared with you the mainstream media coverage that describes him as an angry, anti-feminist lawyer who had run a number of cases trying to protect the dubious rights of men from ladies' nights at a bar, for example. Well, he was found dead in the Catskills area of New York, 2 hours from the New Jersey scene, where he is accused of killing the 20-year-old son of Judge Esther Salas and seriously wounding her husband. Well, now Den Hollander is the prime suspect in the murder here in California of an attorney who was tied to the men's rights movement. And his name is Angelucci. Mark Angelucci. He was found dead in San Bernardino County on the 11th of July, where he was killed in his home. As we reported, Whitney Webb makes a clear connection between the suspect here, Den Hollander, and the Kroll Group, which is a security firm with recruits from the CIA, from Britain's MI6, from Mossad. They have long-standing ties with Deutsche Bank. And so while we don't know the full dimensions of this story, it is getting even more complicated. The Twitter has announced that it is restricting the activities of 150,000 accounts associated with QAnon. In a statement from a spokeswoman who asked not to be identified for fear of retaliation, quote, "These accounts are engaging in behavior designed to further spread content that has resulted in clear and well-documented informational, physical, societal, and psychological offline harm. We have been monitoring the situation closely and determined that additional action is now required pursuant to the Twitter rules against our policies on spam and platform manipulation, as well as abusive behavior." Now, that may be all well and good, but we have to call this what it is. It's censorship. Twitter has proved to be highly inconsistent, particularly in applying its rules to our dear tweeter, the real Donald J. Trump. So I have no affinity for QAnon. They believe that Trump is waging a secret battle against a powerful deep state cabal of Democrats and celebrities engaged in pedophilia and sex trafficking. And we do have pedophilia. Jeffrey Epstein, there you go, prime case. We have sex trafficking. But these details about Democrats participating in it, and that this is part of some worldwide scheme, that is part of the deep state, well, I can only apply skepticism to that because I haven't seen any evidence to establish these claims. I don't believe I've ever, well, maybe once or twice, I've mentioned Kim Kardashian. But I don't do the Kardashians. I don't care about them. I find them an odd group that has managed to find ways to monetize their weirdness. But today I have to show a little respect for Kim Kardashian because she's married to this guy, Kanye West. And he put on a bizarre presentation the other day where he claimed he's running for president. And he had a public meltdown. I mean, he just said weird shit, and even people who are curious about him walked away shaking their heads. Well, Kardashian today issued a statement. As many of you know, Kanye has bipolar disorder. Anyone who has this or has a loved one in their life who does knows how incredibly complicated, painful it is to understand. I've never spoken publicly about how this has affected us at home because I'm very protective of our children and Kanye's right to privacy. But today I feel like I should comment on it because of the stigma and misconceptions about mental health. So she's asking for people to be compassionate. She went on to say he's a brilliant but complicated person who, on top of the pressures of being an artist and a black man, has experienced the painful loss of his mother and has to deal with the pressure and isolation that is heightened by his bipolar disorder. And she says he has resisted attempts by the family to put him into psychiatric care. So I am just going to ignore the claim by Kanye West that he's running for president. And let's hope he gets the help that Kim says he needs. And by the way, I offer respect to Kim Kardashian for the way she's handling this. She is showing adult behavior, which in my limited observations I've never seen before. So Barack and Joe, they shot a video. Both of them walk into a building wearing face masks. They sit down way apart from each other in leather chairs. This appears to be Obama's retirement office in Washington. And in the clip that was released today, We hear Biden say, "Can you imagine standing up when you were president and saying it's not my responsibility? I take no responsibility, literally, literally." And Obama responds, "Those words didn't come out of our mouths when we were in office." So it's an interesting approach. Biden really needs Obama's support. And for all his faults, and I've enumerated them many times, Obama is a brilliant public speaker. He is smart, organized, coherent. A lot of the things that Joe Biden has deficits in. And so we'll see how much this helps. The odd thing is that I watched that video snippet on the Washington Post website. It was immediately followed by a really ugly Trump ad hammering Joe Biden. You wonder how they managed to do that. So yesterday we told you how we're now blaming China because two hackers reported to be working for the Chinese government have been trying to hack into websites to get information on research into treatments or vaccine for COVID. And as a result, the United States issued an order last night for China to close its consulate in Houston, and they gave them until Friday. And this news surfaced because of fires in the courtyard at the consulate. They were burning documents in trash bins. And so China, through a professor at Tsinghua University, said, "At this rate, I wouldn't even be surprised if Trump decides to sever diplomatic relations with China someday. Trump has no limits, principles, morals, and that's why he can stoop so low. And yet few bother to raise an eyebrow." And Mike Pompeo, who plays Secretary of State in this ugly reality TV show, he keeps referring to the Communist Chinese Party, or the Communist Party running China. He likes to get that communist in there. It's a trigger word, I'm sure, in the polling for the Trump base. And in London yesterday, Pompeo expressed the intention to build an international coalition to counter the growing global influence of China. Only we have burned all of our allies, and there are no partners for an America First confrontation with China. In other international news, Jordan's prime minister says the kingdom would look positively on the creation of a binational state that guarantees equal rights to Israelis and Palestinians, because he believes that the proposed annexation of parts of the occupied West Bank will slam the door on a two-state solution. I want you to listen carefully to this quote, because this is coming from the Associated Press. "The international community and the Palestinian leadership remain committed to a two-state solution. Israel rejects the idea of a binational state, fearing an eventual Palestinian majority would endanger its existence as a Jewish and democratic state." They go on to describe that critics say that the annexation would force Israel to choose between being an apartheid state or granting equal rights to all. So this is a significant move. Jordan is a crucial regional player. By calling out Israel and by saying that it is sinking into apartheid. Here's a quote from the Prime Minister. "Nobody in Israel is talking about that, so we cannot just sugarcoat what they're doing. Who's talking about the one-state solution in Israel? They're talking about apartheid in every single sense." And over at Mint Press News, reporter Raul Diego says that the Israeli government is leaking information about recent attacks in Iran. The first in a string of recent fires and explosions that took place on June 25th, when a huge blast took down a power plant in Shiraz. The most high-profile incident occurred July 2nd, when the Iranian nuclear site at Natanz was targeted in a cyber attack, which caused an explosion at the underground facilities. With these attacks, he writes, Israel intends to provoke a belligerent response by Rouhani's government in Iran, while seeding a narrative of cyber warfare as the next theater of global combat. So this is a significant report. We've only been able to speculate that Israel and/or the United States were behind these recent incidents in Iran. And so we will continue to follow this. And finally today, I've been holding on to this for a few days, and I'm going to finish the podcast with this today. It's a very well-written essay by Robert Wright. And last week, we spent a couple of days covering the departure of Barry Weiss from the editorial department at the New York Times. And Robert Wright really gets it right, if you'll forgive that pun, because he notes that while Barry Weiss accuses others at the New York Times of essentially canceling her and expressing opposition to her views, that Barry Weiss is intolerant of people who don't agree with her. And she has been since she was at Columbia University and was recruited to the New York Times from the Wall Street Journal. And Wright writes, Weiss's definition of anti-Semitism is pretty broad. She says anti-Zionism is anti-Semitism. And I agree with that point. She uses anti-Semitism as a weapon, as our friend and listener Ian Berman has pointed out. And she invites the kind of retaliation because she is so intolerant. Again, quoting Mr. Wright, I've already alluded to one common complaint. Weiss has long cast herself as an opponent of cancel culture, yet she repeatedly, if implicitly, encourages canceling people. When you look closely at how Weiss deploys that focus and the consequences of the deployment, the indictment starts gathering force. I think her approach to the anti-Semitism problem seriously damages American political discourse, and her approach is shared by lots of influential people and institutions, which makes her much more important as a case study. And I will add that Bill Maher loves Barry Weiss and brings her on the show repeatedly without defining her history and allows her to lay out these attacks of accusing people of being anti-Semitic because they cross her hair trigger for anti-Semitism. Mr. Wright continues, pretty much every sentient observer of American foreign policy, if they're being honest, would agree that the chances of a war with Iran are increased by the deep antagonism between Israel and Iran, combined with the influence Israel and some of its supporters have on American policy. But not many people will actually say that, and in some cases, that's because saying it might open them to charges of anti-Semitism, and I'm adding, from Barry Weiss and people like her. So I think this is a very well-written analysis of Barry Weiss. It's not mean. It's not vitriolic. It's honest and critical. Check it out. I've linked to it in the show file for today's podcast at peterbcollins.com. Thanks for listening to my daily news and comment podcast. You're free to share it all over the place, even with Barry Weiss. You'll find it on YouTube, and I remain Peter B. Collins.
Happy trails to you until we meet again. Happy trails to you. Keep smiling.